So hello and welcome to the channel and welcome to another Project Cars 2 video. In today's touring car special, I'll be putting all the touring cars through their paces at the A circuit layout at Oschersleben in Germany, courtesy of Andrew Simpson, who posed the question, which of the touring cars is the fastest and what's my views about each of the cars. So before we get into the video, I just want to let you know that I'm not using any sort of special setup for any of these cars. These are all running on their default setups. The only setup changes that I've made is to the steering ratio to adjust it so that I can use my Fanatec GT3 wheel without crossing my hands. The other adjustments that I might have made is to the brake bias, just so that the car feels a little balanced, but I haven't adjusted this on every car. So before we get into the main video and start looking at each of the cars individually around the circuit, let's spend a little bit of time looking over some of the stats and seeing what actually the cars are made of. So starting at the top of the table, with the BMW 320, you'd probably be thinking that it's slightly underpowered with its 315 horsepower compared to the others with 330. But if you look at the weight of the cars, it's actually the lightest car out of the entire group. So with its power to weight ratio, it's actually got the most horsepower with 273 per tonne. With the Mercedes and the Renault, you'd probably be thinking that these are two identical cars, but with the handling characteristics slightly different, the Renault comes out on top, as we'll find out later in our test. So just finishing off with the Opel Astra, looking at the power to weight ratio, it's down all the way with 256 horsepower per tonne, but it's got the fastest 0 to 60 time, but it also weighs the most. So let's see how these cars stack up out in the field, and let's put them through their paces. And if you haven't yet hit that subscribe button, please just take a minute to pause the video and hit the button. It would really help build the channel. So let's move on and take a look at the BMW around the circuit and see how it performs. So let's take a look at this BMW then. It feels pretty well balanced after the initial learning curve on how the car handles and just getting used to that kick of oversteer every time you're coming through a corner. Obviously it's something that we're going to have to get used to, and the more time you spend in this car, the more you'll get used to it. There is definitely a lot of grip in this car, but it's just finding it, learning where to put the power down coming through the corners and where just to ease off a little bit to get the best out of this car. Now, as I mentioned at the start of the video, I have made a few adjustments other than the steering ratio in a few of the cars, and this was one of them. Just making a slight adjustment to the bias of the brakes and just bringing it forward a tiny bit to try and reduce the corner entry oversteer whilst you're on the brake pedal. On the whole, I think the default setup in the BMW is pretty responsive as far as things go. It certainly rewards the driver that's willing to really put this car on its limit, and it is happy coming out of most of the corners slightly sideways. But there is a huge amount of grip in this car once you get used to how it performs, and I'd certainly recommend spending a number of laps to get the best out of this car. I think I was probably about an hour in this car before I really felt comfortable just throwing it into the bends and just getting that power down nice and early. That was the BMW then, the first car in the outing, hitting a 133.360. And it wasn't all plain sailing. This was a little clip showing a tiny touch of the dirt and into the wall. We all make mistakes. So moving on to the Mercedes then, and these cars are in the order in which I drove them. And the Mercedes AMG A45 SMS R Touring. What a name! It's almost as long as it took to get used to how this car drives. So getting into this car coming from the BMW was an absolute shocker. Initially the car feels really horrible. The corner entry oversteer, mid-corner understeer, corner exit understeer, then oversteer, then understeer. Finding the grip in this car takes a little bit of work. The brakes feel a little bit slow to take effect as well, and the car, in my opinion, just feels horribly set up. Driving the Merc is a whole different style of driving compared to the BM, and you're sort of really trying to take the lines through the corners really quite tightly. but through the corners the car does handle slightly better than the BMW once you get used to how this car performs. But the extra weight in the car, that really does start to slow the car down, and you can notice it on the straights. The BMW just starts to pull away. And I think with any of the cars in this class, if you're looking at circuits that have got some long straights on them, the BMW is really going to start to pull into its own, because it's just got so much more torque and it's so much happier on the straights just with that extra horsepower. So there we have the Mercedes that was up against the Renault Ghost, and you can see the difference in the lap times. So moving on to the Megane then, the Renault Megane RS SMSR Touring, another one of those long-winded titles. Anyway, straight out of the box, this car just felt beautiful, super nimble through the corners, even using the default setup, and I don't think I adjusted anything on the setup. It just felt so good. It's so much more tighter than the Mercedes, so much more precise. It's got so much more predictability about its handling. There's not this yaw from oversteer to understeer. The grip just feels really nice through the twisty stuff in this car. There's an instant feel of a good level of grip as well. It's quite heavier on the steering. It's certainly a perfect match against the BMW, but it really does outperform the BMW through the corners, no matter what. The only issue with that is on the straights, the BMW is still pulling away from this car, but the amount of time that you save through the twisty stuff, this car just jumped ahead. It took about 12 minutes in this car to outclass the BMW, and it was the only car through this little test I did that managed to reach into the 132s in under an hour. I mean, like I said, 12 minutes to set this time, and I could probably go on to come back into this car to set an even faster lap, having learned a few things in the Astra trying to actually beat this lap. But yeah, really enjoyed the Renault. So moving on to the Opel Astra just to finish out this series, and what a difference this felt from coming straight from the Renault into this car. Certainly a lot more grip in the Renault, and there's the feeling of a lot more lightness through the wheel, whether you could adjust the casters just to add a little bit more weight to the wheel, but the force feedback certainly feels a lot less in the Astra. Now it does feel probably a little bit less nimble than the Renault, and the lack of front wheel grip is pretty synonymous with front wheel drive cars, but it feels less so in the Astra than it did in the Renault. A little bit less confidence going into the corners, and quite a little bit of a kick of oversteer on corner entry sometimes with this car. The rear end does get a little bit loose. I think I made one click towards the front with this car just to try and reduce some of that corner entry oversteer. But the car does feel pretty good once you get used to it, and it was probably the only car I thought might actually stand a chance of beating the Renault at one stage, but even still, the Renault still outclasses this car. But in my opinion, it's probably the second best out of the front wheel drive cars. Not sure why, I just prefer this over the Mercedes, but I think the out and out class winner for the video is the Renault. So just finishing out the video there with the Opel Astra setting a 133.481, and looking at the final table, it's clear to see that the Renault took the lead at the top of the table, with the BMW followed by the Astra, then the Mercedes. But as I have mentioned before, this is using the default setup, and all these cars could definitely be adjusted to make a little bit of a better time around the circuit. No records broken using the default setups here. But as I did mention before, I think on circuits like Monza, maybe even Bathurst, the BMW blasting down the straights is definitely going to outperform some of these other cars. Now, having spent a bit of time in the BMW, which I really did enjoy driving the most, I thought I would see how it fared against the AI, looking at the last video I made. So I've boosted the AI up to 120% difficulty and 100% aggression, and let's see how I performed. So setting this all up, I put 25 cars initially, but it just seemed to feel like it was stuttering a bit. So I went down to 20 cars in total, and as I mentioned before, setting the AI to 120 and the aggression to 100. Finally, started to do the qualifying, spent 10 minutes qualifying and didn't manage to get anywhere near the top times. The AI are overpowered completely on this circuit, managing to get into the 132s, quite low 132s. So starting out in 9th place, I'll leave you with the replay highlights and see how I progress through the field.
Too wide, right side. Watch your right. Still there. 3 cars wide, 3 cars wide. 1 on your left. Still left. You're good, you're clear. On your left rear corner. All clear. Car left. Nice one, you're clear. All clear. Okay mate, you're on his tail. Let's try and nail him on this lap. Force an error, he's under big pressure. You can take him. He's on your right. You're all clear. You've got 1 on your left. Clear now. Left side. Clear. One length behind. Not 1, 2 lengths back. One length back. 2 lengths back. One left. You're clear. On the left side. 1 on the left. Car on your left. your fastest time in Sector 2 so far today. Great job. Nice one, that's the best second sector so far. Nice one, new PB. Okay, last chance, take the win. Go on, you can do it. Final lap. On your left. All good, you're clear now. He's 2 lengths behind you. He's still there. Behind. That's your fastest second sector so far. Great job. Keep it up. Fantastic drive.
So crossing the line just half a second ahead of second place, and a thoroughly enjoyed race. 120% difficulty, perfect. Thanks for watching as always people, and I hope you're still staying safe, and ciao for now.